The Ptolemaic family tree was not a tree at all, but a twisted vine that looped back on itself generation after generation, brother marrying sister, uncle marrying niece, creating a genetic tangle that would horrify modern geneticists. Cleopatra II had married both her brother, Ptolemy VI, and her other brother, Ptolemy VIII. Cleopatra III married her uncle, and later tried to force her daughter to marry her own brother. The practice had been going on for nearly 3 centuries when Cleopatra VII's turn came, and by then it had produced a dynasty so accustomed to family murder that sibling marriage seemed almost normal by comparison. At least marriage was legal. Murder was technically against the law, even if everyone did it. But Cleopatra's marriage to Ptolemy XIII was different from most Ptolemaic sibling marriages in one crucial way. She never intended it to be real. She was 18, educated, capable, ready to rule on her own. He was 10, a child who needed years of education before he could govern anything. The marriage was a legal fiction, required by their father's will and Egyptian tradition, nothing more. She would rule. He would be the ceremonial co-regent whose name appeared on documents. The arrangement should have worked if everyone had accepted their proper roles. But Ptolemy's advisors had other plans, and they understood that controlling a 10-year-old king was much easier than dealing with an 18-year-old queen who refused to be controlled. The incest was symbolic, a ritual required by custom. The real obscenity was what came after. The advisors who turned a child into a weapon against his own sister. The propaganda campaign that painted her as the threat when they were the ones planning murder, and the civil war that ended with a 13-year-old boy drowning in the Nile, weighed down by the golden armor that symbolized a power he never actually possessed. Before we examine how this doomed marriage developed and ended in tragedy, we need to understand why the Ptolemies practiced sibling marriage in the first place, and what this custom had done to the dynasty over 3 centuries. If you find stories of royal dysfunction and family horror compelling, consider subscribing to join us as we explore more of history's darkest family secrets. The Ptolemaic practice of sibling marriage was not inherited from Macedonian culture. Alexander the Great's generals who founded these dynasties did not practice incest before they conquered Egypt. It was adopted from pharaonic tradition as a way to legitimize foreign rule over a population that had been governed by god-kings for 3,000 years. The ancient Egyptians believed that pharaohs were divine, literal descendants of the gods, and that their blood had to remain pure to maintain that divine connection. Sibling marriage ensured that the royal bloodline was not diluted by commoner blood or foreign influence. When Ptolemy I Soter claimed Egypt after Alexander's death, he faced legitimacy problem. He was a Macedonian general, a foreigner with no connection to the ancient dynasties that Egyptians considered legitimate. His solution was to adopt Egyptian royal customs, including the practice of sibling marriage, to present himself and his descendants as proper pharaohs rather than foreign occupiers. The first few generations of Ptolemies did not actually practice sibling marriage consistently. Ptolemy I married Berenice, who was not his sister. Ptolemy II Philadelphus was the first to marry his full sister, Arsinoe II, and he did so late in life after both had been married to other people. The marriage was shocking even by the standards of the time. Greek culture found sibling marriage abhorrent, and critics called it barbaric and unnatural. But Ptolemy II promoted his sister wife as a goddess, built temples in her honor, and established the precedent that Ptolemaic rulers could and should marry their siblings to demonstrate their divine status and their connection to pharaonic tradition. Subsequent generations embraced the practice with increasing frequency until by Cleopatra's time it had become the expected pattern rather than an occasional exception. The genetic consequences of 3 centuries of inbreeding are impossible to measure precisely because we do not have DNA from most Ptolemaic rulers. But we can infer the problems from what happened to other royal dynasties that practiced extensive inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs, who married cousins and nieces for generations, developed severe genetic disorders, including the famous Habsburg jaw, mental disabilities, and fertility problems that eventually ended the line entirely. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg king, was so inbred that he was physically and mentally disabled, unable to chew food properly, unable to produce an heir, described by contemporaries as resembling a ghost more than a living person. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of a child born to siblings, the result of generations of uncle-niece and cousin marriages that had concentrated harmful recessive genes to catastrophic levels. The Ptolemies probably suffered similar issues, though the historical record focuses on their political and military failures rather than their physical or mental health. We know that several later Ptolemies were described as weak, sickly, or mentally unstable. Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father, was called Auletes, the flute player, partly because of his love of music, but also possibly because of some physical deformity that affected his voice or appearance. The dynasty produced fewer children over time, suggesting declining fertility. Multiple rulers died young from causes that ancient sources describe vaguely, which could indicate genetic disorders that affected health and longevity. Whether this was caused by genetic factors or by the poisonous court culture that the incest produced is impossible to determine, but the two were almost certainly reinforcing each other. The family murders that characterized the Ptolemaic dynasty were partly a consequence of the sibling marriage system. When brothers and sisters shared the throne, they also competed for power, and competition between rulers with equal claims often ended in violence. Ptolemy XIII murdered his nephew, then married his nephew's widow, who was also his own sister, then later tried to have his own son killed. Cleopatra III murdered one son and tried to murder another. Berenice IV seized the throne from her father and was executed when he returned with Roman backing. The pattern was consistent. Sibling marriage created situations where multiple people had legitimate claims to rule, and the Ptolemaic solution was usually to kill the rivals rather than share power. Cleopatra VII grew up watching this pattern repeat, understanding that her siblings were not family members to love and trust, but potential threats who might need to be eliminated. The marriage ceremony between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII in 51 BC was probably a relatively modest affair compared to earlier Ptolemaic weddings. Egypt was in financial crisis, the treasury was depleted by the previous king's debts to Rome, and there was no money for the kind of elaborate celebration that would normally accompany a royal wedding. The ceremony would have followed Egyptian ritual. The siblings presented to the priests, blessed by the gods, declared husband and wife and co-rulers of the two lands. Egyptian marriage rituals for royalty involved symbolic elements that connected the couple to the divine. The pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, and his sister wife was associated with Isis. The priests would have performed rituals blessing the union, invoking the gods to protect the marriage and ensure the dynasty's continuation. Incense would have filled the temple, the scent of myrrh and frankincense marking the ceremony as sacred. The couple would have exchanged symbolic gifts, rings or bracelets representing their bond, though everyone present knew the bond was political rather than personal. Cleopatra was 18 years old, tall for a woman of her time, educated in Greek philosophy and rhetoric, fluent in multiple languages, trained to govern since childhood. She would have worn the double crown of Egypt, the red and white crown symbolizing Upper and Lower Egypt united under her rule. Ptolemy XIII was 10 years old, a child who had barely begun his education, physically immature, completely unprepared for the responsibilities that his birth had thrust upon him. He probably looked absurd in his royal regalia, a boy drowning in the ceremonial robes and crowns that signified pharaonic power. The visual contrast between them would have been striking and would have made clear to everyone present that this was not a partnership of equals, but a political arrangement where one partner would rule and the other would serve as ceremonial decoration. The marriage. was obviously not going to be consummated. Ptolemy was too young, and even the Ptolemies recognized that some standards had to be maintained. But the legal and political reality was that they were now married, bound together in a relationship that neither had chosen and that would ultimately destroy them both. The power dynamic in this marriage was clear from the beginning and was exactly what Cleopatra's father had intended when he wrote his will. Ptolemy XII knew that his daughter was far more capable than any of his sons, but Egyptian tradition and political reality required a male co-ruler. By marrying Cleopatra to her youngest brother, rather than to an older sibling or a foreign prince, Ptolemy XII ensured that she would be the senior partner in the relationship. She was older, more experienced, more intelligent, and she would rule while Ptolemy XIII grew up and learned how to be king. The arrangement was supposed to provide stability, an experienced ruler guiding Egypt while the male heir matured. But it depended on everyone accepting Cleopatra's authority, and the Regency Council that surrounded Ptolemy XIII had no intention of accepting subordinate status to a woman. The Regency Council, Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus, saw Ptolemy XIII as their path to power. A 10-year-old king could be controlled, manipulated, used as a puppet to legitimize their own rule. An 18-year-old queen who knew her own mind and refused to take orders was an obstacle that needed to be removed. They began their campaign against Cleopatra immediately, working to isolate her from sources of power and support. They controlled access to the young king, ensuring that he heard only their version of events and their interpretation of his sister's actions. They spread rumors in Alexandria that Cleopatra was unstable, ambitious beyond what was proper for a woman, planning to eliminate her brother and rule alone. They positioned themselves as loyal servants, protecting the legitimate king from his dangerous sister, when in reality, they were the ones planning elimination and seeking sole power. Cleopatra fought back using the tools available to her. She issued coins bearing only her portrait, establishing her image as the primary ruler. She placed her name before Ptolemy's in official documents, claiming seniority. She conducted diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers without consulting the Regency Council, demonstrating her independence. She cultivated relationships with the Egyptian priesthood, learning to speak Egyptian so she could communicate directly rather than through interpreters, positioning herself as a legitimate pharaoh who understood and honored Egyptian tradition. Every one of these moves was calculated to strengthen her position and weaken the Regency Council's control. Every one of them also increased the council's determination to destroy her, because they understood that if she succeeded in establishing herself as the dominant ruler, they would lose their access to power and possibly their lives. The conflict escalated through 51 and 50 BC, each side probing for weaknesses, building alliances, preparing for the confrontation that everyone knew was coming. Cleopatra tried to win over military commanders, offering promotions and honors to officers who might support her against the Regency Council. Pothinus and Achilles consolidated their control over the army, removing commanders whose loyalty to Cleopatra might exceed their loyalty to the young king. The propaganda war intensified, with both sides presenting themselves as the legitimate authority and the other side as usurpers, threatening Egypt's stability. The sibling marriage that was supposed to unite the dynasty became the focal point of division, with each side claiming to represent the true heir and proper governance. The crisis came to a head in the summer of 49 BC, when the Regency Council convinced Ptolemy XIII to sign an order expelling Cleopatra from Egypt. She was accused of treason, though no specific treasonous acts were identified. The real charge was that she refused to accept the Regency Council's authority, that she acted independently as a ruler, rather than deferring to her brother-husband's supposed supremacy. The expulsion was also implicitly a death warrant. If Cleopatra remained in Egypt or anywhere within reach of the royal army, she would be arrested and executed. The precedent was clear. Ptolemaic rulers who lost power struggles did not retire to peaceful exile. They died, usually quickly, often publicly, sometimes with spectacular cruelty designed to discourage others from similar ambitions. Cleopatra's flight from Alexandria was desperate and dangerous. She could not take a large retinue or significant treasure because she needed to move quickly before the Regency Council's agents could intercept her. She fled east across the Sinai Peninsula with a small group of loyal followers, heading towards Syria, where she hoped to raise an army that could challenge her brother's control of Egypt. The journey was humiliating for someone who had been queen, traveling in disguise, dependent on the loyalty of servants who might betray her for a reward, sleeping in conditions far beneath what she had known in the palace. But she survived the journey and reached Syria, where she began the seemingly impossible task of assembling military forces that could restore her to power. While Cleopatra was in exile raising her army, the situation in Alexandria deteriorated rapidly. The Regency Council proved to be much better at palace intrigue than at actual governance. They raised taxes to pay for military expansion, alienating the population. They mishandled diplomatic relations with neighboring states. They made enemies of the Egyptian priesthood by disrespecting religious traditions and failing to maintain temples. The kingdom that had been relatively stable under Ptolemy XII's weak but non-confrontational rule became increasingly unstable as the Regency Council pursued aggressive policies that demonstrated their incompetence. But they maintained their grip on power because they controlled the army and the young king. And as long as Ptolemy XIII remained their puppet, they could rule in his name regardless of how badly they governed. The Roman Civil War between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great changed everything for both Cleopatra and her brother. When Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge after his defeat at Pharsalus, the Regency Council made the catastrophic decision to murder him. They thought this would curry favor with Caesar and demonstrate their value as Roman allies. Instead, it disgusted Caesar and made him deeply suspicious of their judgment and their reliability. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria in October 48 BC to settle Egypt's civil war and secure the kingdom's grain supply for Rome, he found a situation that offended both his political instincts and his personal values. A capable queen driven into exile by incompetent advisors who controlled a child king and had just committed a barbaric murder. Cleopatra's famous arrival, rolled in a carpet, was her gambit to reach Caesar before the Regency Council could poison him against her. The plan worked brilliantly. Caesar was impressed by her audacity, intrigued by her intelligence, and convinced by her arguments that she was the better ruler for Egypt. His decision to restore the joint rule between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII was nominally a compromise, but actually a complete victory for Cleopatra. She would be the senior partner, backed by Roman military power, while her brother would be reduced to a ceremonial co-ruler with no real authority. The Regency Council understood immediately that they had lost everything, and they responded with violence. The Alexandrian War that followed was the Regency Council's attempt to salvage their position through military force. Achilles led the royal army against Caesar's outnumbered legions, besieging them in the palace quarter of Alexandria. The fighting lasted from October 48 BC until March 47 BC. 5 months of brutal urban warfare that destroyed parts of the city and may have damaged the library of Alexandria. Caesar's military genius and the eventual arrival of reinforcements defeated the Egyptian forces, but not before the war had killed thousands and devastated Egypt's capital. Pothinus was executed by Caesar's orders for continuing to plot even after the war had started. Achilles was killed during the fighting, either by Caesar's forces or by his own soldiers in a dispute over strategy. Theodotus fled Egypt entirely to avoid capture and execution. Ptolemy XIII's death came during the final stages of the war, when he tried to escape from Alexandria by boat. The ancient sources disagree about the details. Some say he was fleeing after a defeat. Others suggest he was trying to reach his army after being held essentially captive by Caesar. What is certain is that his boat capsized or was sunk in the Nile, and he drowned, weighed down by the golden armor that symbolized his royal status. He was 13 years old, 3 years into a marriage that had never been real, 3 years into a reign that had been controlled entirely by advisors he probably barely understood. His body was reportedly recovered from the Nile and displayed to prove that he was dead and that the civil war was over. Cleopatra's brother husband was gone, and she was now sole ruler of Egypt. But the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriage was not finished with Cleopatra. Egyptian custom and political stability required a male co-ruler, and Cleopatra's younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, was the only option available. He was probably 11 or 12 years old in 47 BC when he was elevated to become Cleopatra's new husband and co-regent. This marriage was even more obviously a legal fiction than the previous one. Ptolemy XIV had no power, no party, no political significance beyond his bloodline. He was a placeholder, a name on documents, a living symbol of dynastic continuity. Cleopatra ruled alone while maintaining the pretense of joint rule with her child brother husband. This arrangement lasted until 44 BC, when Ptolemy XIV died under mysterious circumstances that strongly suggest poisoning. Cleopatra needed him eliminated so that her son, Caesarion, could become her co-ruler, and Ptolemy XIV conveniently died at exactly the right moment. The last of Cleopatra's brothers was gone, and with him the last requirement for maintaining the fiction of sibling marriage. The practice of sibling marriage in the Ptolemaic dynasty had produced nearly 3 centuries of genetic problems, family murders, and political instability, and it ended with Cleopatra. She had been forced to marry 2 of her brothers, both children, both political tools rather than real partners, both dead before reaching adulthood. She had no intention of continuing the tradition with her own children. Caesarion never married his half-sister Cleopatra Selene, and the 3 children she had with Mark Antony were paired with foreign royalty or client rulers rather than with each other. The Ptolemaic experiment in dynastic incest ended with the dynasty itself, destroyed by the same Roman power that had eventually conquered Egypt, despite all of Cleopatra's intelligence and effort. The question of whether Cleopatra's marriages to her brothers were ever consummated is impossible to answer with certainty, but the evidence strongly suggests they were not. Ptolemy XIII was 10 when they married, far too young. Ptolemy XIV was 11 or 12, still prepubescent, and the marriage lasted only 3 years. Cleopatra had no children by either brother, which is significant because she demonstrated her fertility by having 4 children with 2 other men. The absence of children suggests that these marriages remained purely legal and symbolic. But the lack of physical consummation did not make the marriages any less disturbing or politically damaging. Cleopatra was legally married to children, bound in relationships that violated Greek sensibilities, even as they satisfied Egyptian tradition. Her enemies used these marriages as evidence of Eastern decadence. The narrative was that Cleopatra represented a world where natural law was violated, where sisters married brothers and murdered each other with equal casualness. This narrative was profoundly unfair. Cleopatra had not chosen these marriages and had ended the practice as soon as she had sufficient control. But fairness was irrelevant to propaganda. The psychological impact of growing up in a family where sibling marriage and sibling murder were both normal is impossible to measure, but was certainly profound. Cleopatra had watched her father murder her sister. She had been forced to marry 2 of her brothers. She had seen rivals and relatives killed throughout her childhood and youth. She had learned that family ties meant nothing when power was at stake, that sentiment was weakness, that survival required constant vigilance and willingness to eliminate threats regardless of blood relationships. This education shaped how she ruled, how she approached political relationships, and how she managed the constant dangers that surrounded her. She was not cruel by nature, but she had learned to be ruthless when necessary, and the distinction between cruelty and necessity had been blurred by 3 centuries of Ptolemaic family horror. The end of the sibling marriage tradition with Cleopatra's death represents one of the few positive outcomes of the Roman conquest. Octavian had no interest in maintaining Ptolemaic customs, and Egypt became a Roman province. The practice of sibling marriage disappeared from royal practice in the Mediterranean world. Modern genetics has demonstrated what the Ptolemies learned through bitter experience. that close inbreeding produces genetic disorders and weakens populations. The Ptolemaic dynasty's decline was not solely caused by incestuous marriages, but those marriages contributed to the instability and eventual collapse. Cleopatra's forced marriages to her brothers were symptoms of a deeper dysfunction in the Ptolemaic system, a dynasty that had adopted the worst aspects of pharaonic tradition without the cultural and religious framework that had made those traditions meaningful to ancient Egyptians. For the Ptolemies, sibling marriage was a political tool rather than a religious requirement, a way to claim legitimacy and concentrate power. But it produced exactly the opposite of its intended effect, creating situations where multiple siblings had equal claims to rule and had to compete through violence for supremacy. The system guaranteed instability, encouraged family murder, and normalized relationships that Greek culture found abhorrent. Cleopatra was the last victim of this system, forced into marriages she never wanted, with brothers who became her enemies, survivors of a tradition that had poisoned the dynasty for 300 years and that finally died when she did. The story of Cleopatra's marriages to her brothers is not a love story or even a tragic romance. It is a story of political necessity, dynastic dysfunction, and the human cost of royal traditions that valued bloodline purity over human dignity. She was married to children, ruled beside brothers who were turned into weapons against her, and survived by being more ruthless and more intelligent than the men who tried to destroy her. The incest was the smallest obscenity, in a system that routinely murdered children, destroyed families, and sacrificed everything human to the demands of power. When the last of her brothers drowned in the Nile, weighed down by golden armor he had never truly worn as a real king, the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriage was effectively over. It had produced 3 centuries of horror, and it ended as it had been practiced, in violence, betrayal, and the death of someone too young to understand the forces that had destroyed them.